introduce our presenter. Hello from Hebrew College and welcome to today's webinar, Pesach and What If We Were Truly Free? Our presenter is Rabbi Ebn Leader, who grew up in Jerusalem and was a student disciple of Rabbi David Hartman, where he learned Talmud, and of Amos Hetz, where he studied movement and movement notation. He is currently a student of Hebrew College Rector Art Green, from whom he has received private ordination. Leader has a growing international reputation as a Jewish spiritual thinker in the neo-Hasidic tradition and as an authority on Jewish prayer. Rabbi Leader, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, everybody, for taking time to be together in this time, which is a preparation for Pesach time in the Jewish calendar. We sometimes don't pay enough attention to the fact that how important preparation is for our calendar. All of the big biblical holidays all have, in rabbinic literature, periods of almost 2 months of preparation for them. So everybody remembers that we prepare for Shavuot by counting the Omer for 50 days prior to that. So most people remember that before Sukkot, we have a preparation period that starts at Rosh Chodesh Elul. About 50 days prior to that, we're in preparation mode. And that for Pesach, we begin preparing with the Torah readings of the 4 weeks that start the week before Rosh Chodesh Adar, which is again about 50 days before. The importance of being able to understand and give as much importance to the preparation period as to the holiday itself is that it pushes us more into understanding that this is really about a process, and it's about a process of growing and developing much more than about a particular experience. Sometimes we grow much too dependent on the notion of, oh, like, is it a great service, or is something amazing going to happen in this high holiday service, or at this seder, or somewhere else. But really, it's not about the experience, and it's not about a particular moment in which things happen, but it's about being part of a process out of which some of these high points and communal get-togethers are an expression of, and not a thing that stands on its own. So I think it's good to take this discussion we're having now today and understand it as part of the preparation of value on itself in this process that is our whole Pesach process, that is our whole month or couple of months of going through the process of taking in spring. Part of living in a religious process and living a religious life devoted to process is understanding that it has its own rhythms. And that particularly the religious life has a rhythm of breathing in and breathing out, which is to say the times in which we put out things into the world, and that's our religious activity, and the times in which we take in things, and that's a big part. That's a religious activity as well. Now, that's in some sense, that's our partnership with God. Right, we know that the Midrash teaches us that it says, Kol ha'omer vayechulu b'leilei Shabbatot na'aseh shutaf l'maaseh bereshit. Anybody who says the paragraphs of Vayechulu, who says Kiddush on Friday nights, becomes a partner in the work of creation, in the creation of the world. And a partnership, I mean, we're usually very excited about this notion of partnership insofar as we remember, oh yes, I have a job to do. And, you know, like if one of probably the most commonly known Hebrew words in our communities is this concept of tikkun olam, right? We have a job, we are partners, we have to help God in the work that we do. But something that we don't always pay as much attention to in our communities is the fact that that's the breathing out part. There's also a breathing in part. There's another side to the partnership. There's a part of God. What does God give me? What are the places where I am receiving something which is also part of this relationship of my giving out. And for some reasons, which I may touch on a little more later on, we tend to emphasize that part somewhat less. And I want to give sort of an example. I want to share a Hasidic teaching about Shabbat. We'll get to Pesach in a minute, but about Shabbat that talks about the breathing in part, talks about not receiving. And I'm reading from the Me'or Einayim, who is a Hasidic teacher, a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov and of the Maggid of Mezrich, which means we're talking the second, third generation of Hasidic masters, late 18th century. I'm reading from a book of his teachings on the Torah called Me'or Einayim on Parashat Ki Tisa. I'm reading a translation that's in a collection of these teachings called Speaking Torah, edited by Arthur Green and some other people. And in this piece he writes, or he spoke and then it was written down, a person engages in work in response to a need. There is something lacking that will be completed through the work. Shabbat, being perfect in all aspects, lacks nothing, needs no work to fulfill any need. Therefore, our sages taught that you should celebrate Shabbat as if all your work is done and you lack nothing. On Shabbat, the completely perfect divinity spreads forth and reveals itself in the Israelite people. If you behave otherwise, implying that you still have needs, you demonstrate that you are not part of that community, and you act as though the divine presence did not rest upon you. But it is not only regular work that is prohibited. Even work on the tabernacle is prohibited on Shabbat. The tabernacle we are discussing is the one referred to in the verse, I shall dwell within the children of Israel, v'shachanti betocham. The Blessed Holy One dwells within the Israelite people, and you are to become a dwelling place for the divine presence. But even if you are impure with sin, impeding the dwelling of the divine within you, on Shabbat you should forget about this and not let it sadden you. Just keep Shabbat as it should be kept, and rejoice in the Blessed One, who is total acceptance and joy. Even the work of the tabernacle, the work you need to do to become a dwelling place for the divine, should not be done on Shabbat. Right? His teaching is based on a fascinating classic rabbinic teaching on the verse, Sheshet Yamim Ta'avod V'asita Kol Melachtecha. For 6 days you should work and do all of your work. Ubayom HaShvi'i Shabbat L'Adonai Elohecha. And on the 7th day, it is Shabbat for God. And the early rabbis ask, why is the emphasis on kol melachtecha, on all of your work? And they say that when Shabbat comes around, you should put yourself into a mental state, ke'ilu kol melachtecha asuya. Not that you should stop your work and take a rest from it, but rather you should enter the mental place as if all of your work is done, is finished, as if there's nothing more to do. Right, so one has to distinguish, right, the teaching they're offering here is a distinction between rest as a means and Shabbat as an end. Right? If I say I'm going to stop working on Shabbat so that I have more energy to continue working next week, then the work I am doing is the end. That's the thing I'm working towards, and Shabbat is just a means to do that better. And often I think we think of our weekends that way. That is, I need to recuperate from all the work I've done in order to be able to continue and do more of that work in the next week. But what the Midrash is offering is a different alternative. To say, no, you have to enter into a space on Shabbat as if the work is done, as if you have achieved everything that you ever have to achieve, as if there is no Monday or Sunday, or whichever it is, in which you would go back to work again. Right? That's a different context of seeing Shabbat as a totally different space, which is not related in that sense, to the particular work or to the particular place we happen to be in the work that we're doing. The Ma'or Einaim takes it even further. Right? The Ma'or Einaim says this is not just external work that you have to imagine is done on Shabbat. It's the internal work on yourself. Can you take time, the Ma'or Einaim challenges us to think, can you take time on Shabbat to imagine that all the work you need to do on yourself is all done? As if you have overcome your arrogance, you've overcome your impatience, you've overcome your anger, you've overcome your insecurity. You'll go back to work on all of those on Sunday. But the challenge of Shabbat for the Ma'or Einaim is to say, for 24 hours or 25 hours, can I enter into a space, into a world, into an experience? Can I communally, and it's a major project to try to actually create an experience like that and to create a communal setting that supports such an experience. But can I create an experience of fullness, of not having something to worry about that has to be done in the next week? Right? That's Shabbat, but that's Shabbat, right? That's a religious experience that is not about what we can do or what we need to do. Right? That is Shabbat as a breathing in, as a receiving, as a living in a different space, which lives in balance with the breathing out, with the working towards that we do throughout the whole week. So where does Pesach fall into this? Right? The holidays in general have to be understood in the way they're sort of spread out through the Jewish year. In the calendar, the holidays have to be understood as different qualities of breathing in. That is, different ways in which God becomes present to us and God gives to us, if we are, of course, open and create the framework in which we can receive, that happen throughout the year. And each time we approach a holiday, we have to ask, what is the particular quality? What is a particular quality of divinity that I want to open myself to in this year? That I want in this holiday, in this particular time? What is the quality that I'm going to receive? And everything we do on the holiday, our practices, the stories we tell about the holiday, the mythology, everything we do around the holiday is all an attempt to create a vessel for ourselves to be open to this particular experience of the divinity. So if I want to understand what Pesach is about, right, then I have to look and see, okay, so what are our practices about? What are the stories we tell about Pesach? What aspect of the divinity is manifest in the stories we tell about Pesach? And definitely it is going to have to be something about redemption, right? Because there is no question, that's this theme. That's what Pesach is about. Pesach is about the story of redemption. But I now have to answer and I have to understand what actually is the quality of redemption. What does redemption mean when we celebrate it on Pesach? And to help us think about that, I would like to share an earlier text in the Ma'or Einaim, a text of classical midrash that comes from the Midrash Rabbah on Shir HaShirim. Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, is traditionally read on Pesach. So many of the rabbinic teachings on Shir HaShirim relate to Pesach and relate to the story of Pesach. And so this is a particular series of teachings on the verse from Shir HaShirim chapter 2, Kishoshana ben hachochim ken ra'ayati ben habanot. Like a lily among the thorns, so is my bride among women. And I am now reading the words of the Midrash. Rabbi Eliezer applied this verse to the Exodus from Egypt. When a lily grows between thorns, the owner has difficulty retrieving it. Thus also redeeming Israel was difficult for the Holy Blessed One. This is implied in the verse from Deuteronomy, or has a God ever attempted to take a nation out of a nation? Rabbi Yeshua said in the name of Rabbi Chana, the verse does not distinguish between one nation and the other. Both were uncircumcised, both grew their hair, both wore kilayim. Strict judgment would have never allowed Israel to be redeemed. And so they're saying something very interesting. Right? The Midrash is saying, taking Israel out of Egypt is not a self-evident move on God's part. Actually, they say, strict judgment, if we look at it, there's no reason to do it. We're comfortable telling a story in which the Israelite people are the good guys, they're the oppressed people, they're the people who have done no wrong, they're the people who are, of course, worthy of being saved by God. And on the other hand, the Egyptians are the bad guys in the story, they are the evil oppressor, and it is self-evident that there's a qualitative difference between the Israelite people and the Egyptian people, and that's why the Israelite people are taken out of Egypt. And that's why God saves the Israelite people and takes them out of Egypt. But the Midrash offers a very interesting way of thinking about this, or offers a challenge, I would say, to that kind of thinking. And goes back to the verse in Deuteronomy and says, oh, look at this amazing thing. God took one nation out of another without making any kind of distinction between them. And Rabbi Yeshua says, what Rabbi Yeshua says in the Midrash is that really, if you look at them in terms of quality, in terms of behavior, in terms of practices, there was no difference. The Jews were not inherently different from the Egyptians among which they were living. There was nothing the Jewish people did that made them deserve to be saved from Egypt. I have to think about that for a minute. Right? There was nothing the Jewish people did, there was nothing about them that made them deserve to be taken out of Egypt. The Midrash continues and says, you know what? The people of Israel themselves, they were aware of that. They knew that. On the next verse, I hear the sound of my beloved coming, skipping over mountains, leaping over hills, right? From the same chapter of the Song of Songs. The Midrash tells, our masters taught, the sound of my beloved coming refers to Moshe. When he came and told the Israelites, this month you will be redeemed. But the people responded, our teacher Moshe, how can we be redeemed when all of Egypt stinks of our idolatry? That is, the people themselves know, or the people themselves have in their minds, that they are not worthy of being redeemed. Moshe responded, because God desires your redemption. Because God desires your redemption, God will not pay attention to your idolatry. God will skip over the mountains. Mountains allude to idolatry, because often mountaintops are the location of idolatry, as in the verse, they sacrifice on the mountaintops and offer incense upon hills. So God will ignore the mountains, right, and will redeem you this month. Thus Scripture says, this month is yours. So Moshe does not tell the people, oh, no, you're great, you're really good, you don't appreciate yourself enough. Right? Moshe tells the people, you're right. You're right. But God loves you, and God is going to take you out of this place of oppression. Not because you deserve it, but because God loves you. Now, a lot of you are probably thinking, oh, yeah, I know this. Catholics call it grace, right? The undeserving gift we get from God's love, even though we ourselves do not deserve it. The Jews are very uncomfortable talking about that. Not for all of the history of Judaism, but I would say probably since the 19th century. You have to remember that Jews in every survey are one of the most secular people in the United States, and a big part of that has to do with our deep connection to enlightenment and emancipation. Right? It is very important to remember that until enlightenment came around in Europe in the 19th century, and with it emancipation, we were basically treated as subhuman. And suddenly, along with enlightenment came emancipation, and we suddenly had the chance to be treated as human beings again. Not that it always worked out for the best, and Europe's Judaism then experienced the Shoah and the Second World War. But just that move remained so powerful for Jews, who became so totally committed to enlightenment because of that, consciously or unconsciously. We are still the people of enlightenment, and that's enlightenment, and that is still the work that we're doing as a people. Sort of we're dealing with that process of what does it mean to come from 1,000 years of being an oppressed subhuman people throughout Europe, throughout Christian Europe, and in some parts of the Muslim world as well, and suddenly to take a step out and to be given the opportunity to be human beings again. So we have a very, very strong commitment to enlightenment, and to enlightenment in the 19th century started a whole flow of secularism. And out of that, I think still we as Jews, and certainly we as Jews in America, and we as liberal Jews in America, have a hard time talking about God. And we definitely have a hard time talking about an active God, as sort of, oh, God loves me, or God does something for me in the world. But it's very hard, and I think in some ways not real, to have a religion in which humans are the only active part, are the only active partner, in which religion is all about, can I build community? What can I do for tikkun olam? How can I make the world a better place? There is a crucial part of religion in which God is a partner, and God is active. And as difficult as it may sound for the first moment, if we lean back for a moment, or as we say in Pesach language, if we recline, right, and we think of everything we have received that has nothing to do with our own work, right? If you think, I mean, start with just the gift of life. I don't deserve that. Nobody deserves that. Of the air we breathe every day. Of the times in life when we really, when you, when I got a break from the universe. When we were helped out, not because of how good we were, not because we deserved anything. That place of grace, the place of God's love, the place of God, that God is there for you, even when you don't deserve it. Right? That's the beginning of redemption. That's the redemption of Pesach. The freedom that we celebrate on Pesach, right, if we read it through the eyes of this midrash, the freedom that we celebrate on Pesach is in some ways the freedom from the fantasy that I have to fix it all. That if I don't do it, it won't happen. That there is something there in the world. God is going to be there for me, and God does not work on my schedule, and God does not step in and do X when I want God to do X. But in a deep way, to access the humility which is involved in accepting grace. The humility which means that it's not all up to me. And that cannot be to take that, to celebrate that, rather than see that as a deep, frustrating failure, to celebrate the freedom of that. That's Pesach. Now, it's important also to remember, it's very important to remember when we talk in this context, to remember that Jewish redemption, or redemption as we talk about it in the Pesach story, is not salvation. That those are two different things, right? When we think culturally, when we think about salvation, we think, okay, I've been taken out of the bad place, I've been saved, I'm in a good place. When we think about the Jewish story of redemption, when we're taken out of Egypt, we're dropped into the desert, right? Deuteronomy looks back at that desert and says, right, the great and terrible desert, a place of scorpions and snakes where there is no water to drink. That's where we are redeemed into. Right? Our whole religion is a religion of people who walk through the desert, who look around and discover that God is there walking with them, that they aren't alone, that God is providing water and food along the road. But we are a religion of wanderers through the desert. And redemption, such as we have it, just takes us to the place where we can actually walk with God in this desert. That's very important to remember. Our Torah never reaches the promised land. Right? We wander with it for 40 years in the desert, and then when we reach the edge of the promised land, we end the story and we start it all over again. We don't have a Torah for salvation of that sort, for reaching the promised land. We have a Torah for wandering through the desert. And on Pesach, we remember that we don't control, we can control, we can't fix everything in it. And God is the one who is carrying us through and who is endlessly giving us the gifts of redemption that allow us to continue walking through it. Which is paradoxically why it is so important to have with you in your Pesach celebration guests that could not have otherwise celebrated Pesach in this way. Right? Not just the people who you invite to the Seder this year and they're going to invite you next year. Right? The commitment of the community, right, is that every person be able for at least this one night to access that sense of grace, of God has given me a break. When the Mishnah says, "Afilu ani she'b'Yisrael notnim lo arba kosot," we make sure that even the poorest person has 4 cups of wine for that night. We're giving the person a break. It's not going to change the entire life. Right? It's not going to solve all the systemic problems. But for one night, we want to connect to that place of grace, of undeserving love, of just the possibility of sitting and receiving that gift. It's also why it is very important and is part of the liturgy of the Haggadah to have an open-ended invitation for the Seder, so that you don't control everything. To really open the Seder, to have the possibility of people showing up that you had not planned, that you do not know, that you do not control. So you can all sit together and experience being held by God. Yeah. Maybe a few more people will show up and maybe we'll have to eat smaller portions. But we can all sit and be held by God together. So I've made it my practice in these past few years to make sure I send out an email before the holiday to all of my students and the people on the listserv and say, if anybody gets stuck, if anybody has any need, just come. You don't need to announce yourself. Knock on our door. Come in, join our Seder. Because a deep part of the freedom of Pesach is I don't have to control everything. I don't have to know exactly how many people are going to be there and exactly how many portions are going to be there. I'm free of that on Pesach. Again, that doesn't solve the systemic problems. It's trying for one moment to live in that grace and that love. You know, when you start the work again, when you start thinking about everything that has to be done, when you step back to my side of the partnership, right, that happens at the end of the second Seder, the end of the second night. The end of the second Seder, we start counting Omer. As we start counting 49 days leading up to Shavuot. That preparation, that's about our work. That's about what are the things that I need to be able to fix, that I need to change in the world, in my life, in myself, in order to be able to fully and honestly reach the place of loving covenant at Sinai on Shavuot. So that point, the point of starting to count the Omer at the end of the second Seder, that's a good place to begin starting to think about everything that's wrong and all the work that we need to do. But if we're doing that throughout the whole Seder, if you sit down on Pesach and much of your conversation is about all of the evil that's happening in the world and all of the people who are oppressed and all of the work that needs to be done, you're missing the opportunity to open yourself for God's grace. You're getting stuck. If you don't leave room for opening to God's grace, you're getting stuck in the place of the arrogance that thinks, yes, I have to do, I control. And if you're stuck in that place forever, you're going to burn out. You won't be able to do that work well. This is why I think it's actually not the best idea to focus on all these slaveries of the world during this night of celebration of the Seder. I think the most important mitzvah of Pesach, of Leila Seder, is to lean back, not to lean in. Every other day of the year, you lean in. But on Pesach, you recline. On Pesach, you lean back and thank God for being there for us, always. Even at the times when it seems, when we're experiencing it as the most difficult. And perhaps harder for some of us who live in tremendous privilege when we know that there are many others all around us who are experiencing it. It's much more difficult than we do in our daily lives. So I hope all of you have a wonderful Chag and are able to open to at least a few moments of true freedom at this Seder, and that sustains you in the wonderful work you're doing throughout the whole year. Chag Sameach, everyone. Thank you.
All right. Rabbi Leader, thank you so much. There were at least one or two questions that I wanted to start with, and then we'll see if our audience wants to ask some more questions, has some more comments that they'd like to share. Please remember to use the chat button on your screens to submit questions. either directly just to the panelists or to the entire group. Monica, I thought, had an interesting comment contrasting the surrender controlling in Pesach that you mentioned, Rabbi Leader, with the order that is suggested by the Haggadah and the Seder itself. I wonder if you might comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to explain what I think the question is, I think, right, I'm focusing here, I'm saying, oh, this is all about freedom, it's all about letting go, it's all about understanding you don't control, where in many ways, if you look at Pesach, particularly if you look at the preparation for Pesach, it may be, right, the most obsessive compulsive holiday in the Jewish calendar. And particularly when we look at the evening itself, right, it has this very laid out organization, it has this sequence. First you do one thing, then you do the other, then you do the fourth. So it seems to be a sort of really set framework, and the question, as I understand it at least, is does that not come in contrast or in contradiction to this idea of letting go? So I think, I mean, there are different ways to think about that. I'll just offer two things and then open maybe to other questions or other possibilities. One way of thinking about that, or one aspect, is thinking about the difference between preparing for the holiday and what preparation allows to happen on the holiday itself. That is there a process, does the very careful and meticulous process of preparing a vessel, is that the thing that actually allows for a freedom, for a letting go to happen afterwards? But of course, I think we have to look at that more in the focus on the evening itself. And that really opens into the broader question of the relationship between discipline and freedom. And I think, you know, we have to think about that seriously. And we often think that, you know, freedom is related to lack of discipline. But I think what all of the spiritual teachers of all of the religious traditions have taught us is that there is actually a very strong relationship between being able to accept structures, forms, and the capacity to actually experience freedom. My dance teacher, who you mentioned earlier in the introduction, Amos Hetz, he often used to, who was a totally secular person, often used to demonstrate that by showing us videos of people in dance clubs or in disco clubs. And because I was at the time learning movement and analyzing movement, he would say, okay, everybody analyze the movements of the people who are dancing here and see what they're doing. And we would look, and with a place with, you know, no rules and no formal limitation on what you're allowed to do, people were extremely limited in what they were doing. Every person was doing one, maybe two movements with half a variation on them from time to time. But then if you take the same dance place and say people, give a random rule, say, okay, now you have to do it with one hand behind your back. Suddenly, like new kinds of dances, new things come out that the person never thought of before. So we have to think, I think it's very useful to remember to think about the structures, not only, you know, from the child place that looks at them and says, oh my God, you're telling me what to do. That's terrible. I can't do what I want to do. But as the things that help us in our own discipline to break out of habits. Because that was the other thing, right? Amos used to say, he said, you used to think that feels natural. Natural is a different word for habitual. It feels good, it feels right to you because those are your habits. But then you take a series of structures, you set structures in place, and suddenly it frees you from your habit to do all sorts of things. So I think a lot of us carry injuries from younger ages and from different contexts in which we felt oppressed by religious people telling us what to do. And we still have to sort of live out our rebellions against that. But if we can maybe be freed from some of that rebellion as well and come to develop a relationship with these structures as structures for discipline and freedom rather than as oppressive ideas that somebody else has put on us, I think there's tremendous, tremendous freedom to be found just in the fact that there is such clear structure for the evening and for the ritual itself.
Thank you. I know we wanted to finish up in a couple minutes. Let me just throw at least one other question at you, although there are a couple more here. Alan asks, how do you advise those of us who find it challenging to lean back and feel freedom to do so during this time of the year?
Well, I think there are a few things that I would say about that. One thing, the simplest thing is to start by the negative, by negating, which is to say, don't do everything that is going to cause you to feel oppressed. That is, don't spend all the time thinking, or don't spend your whole seder, or spend your whole time around Pesach thinking about everything that's wrong in the world and everything that you have to fix in the world, because that's not going to lead you to a place of freedom. That's what most of us have been doing every day, all the time, around the clock for the past few months. Right? There's been a constant presence that the news has been very helpful in evoking for us about what is wrong with the world, what work we still need to do, how we need to help fix things and make things better. So I think one thing I would say about that is try to think, is it possible for you to actually think about Pesach, which is part of what or at least the Seder, which is part of what I'm offering here, as not a continuation of that, not yet another opportunity to enhance that, to make even a stronger statement about how terrible things are and how much work we have to do. Not to say that I don't agree with that. I think that's totally true, and things are terrible, and we have so much things to do, and it's very important to do that. But I think if we cannot create the spaces, and I think that's the power of religion and community, to create spaces in which we step into a different experience, into an experience of being held, rather than into the experience of what do I have to do and what do I have to hold, then we will burn ourselves out, and then we will not be able to do the work we're doing, the work we want to do significantly to make change in the world. And the other thing I want to say about that is, and it goes back to the thing I started with, which is it doesn't happen on one night. That is, if you think, okay, it's all about this great ritual, I'm going to come on Pesach and I'm going to feel free, it doesn't happen that way. I mean, maybe something will happen, and maybe, maybe you'll be held. There'll be this moment of grace, and you'll just have this amazing laid back, yeah, I am held by God moment. But I think a lot of the thing I talked about when we first started in preparation is about that. That is, I spend the month before Pesach working up towards Pesach and trying to think about what are the ways in which I can open myself to be held in that way. And if I work on that throughout the month to Pesach, then maybe there's more of a chance that actually on Leila Seder, something could happen and I could be held, and I could actually open myself to being held rather than just letting go of it. So, I mean, obviously those are not very practical, you should do X, do Y, which I don't think I can do in this particular context. But I think what I can say in such a general forum is I think a lot of it is about the preparation, and I think you can at least try to not to undermine the process.
I think we have time for one last question from Julie. Where does the prophetic voice fit at Pesach?
Yeah, I'm not sure I know what the prophetic voice is. I also tend to be a little suspicious about prophetic voices in general. But I think, to be able to say and experience and live as being held by God is a tremendous gift, a tremendous lesson. Now, the next night, I definitely imagine is standing out there at the street corners and shouting, we are not upholding equality in our communities, saying, we are still living in a world in which black and white are not equal, black and white are not equal. And finding ways to be able to say that, finding ways to resist power at the places where power is being used in an oppressive way. But I'm not sure that kind of move, which is often identified with the prophetic voice, is actually the one that we need to do on this particular night. And I think the sense all the time, there's one thing I need to be doing, and it has to be said at every opportunity, and it has to be pushed forward, is actually destructive to much of the work that we're doing. And I think we do a tremendous good by listening to the places where our tradition offers us windows to other things that we need to do in order to be fulfilling and doing God's work in the world. And some of those things are not about us being active and us being in control.
Good. Well, I think we're getting close to the amount of time we wanted to spend. I thank you, Rabbi Leader, for your thoughts today, for sharing with us. If there are some last-minute questions that I haven't gotten to, my apologies. I'll do my best to pass those along to Rabbi Leader. Maybe he can respond directly to you. I, again, want to thank you all for joining us today. And if anyone does have any follow-up questions, please take a look at this panel here. Feel free to email either Rabbi Leader or myself, and we'll do our best to respond to you as quick as we can. And
I'll say one more thing on that. Yes, much of what I have, if people want to go and are more reading people rather than listening, much of what I have said today, including the texts themselves, can be found on the Hebrew College website in the Torah teaching section. Under Pesach, there's a text study for Pesach with my name on it, and both these texts and much of these thoughts appear there. So you can go to hebrewcollege.edu and find it there. Thank you all, and Chag Sameach.
thank you for joining us, everyone.